The Eternal Twin, a Yellowstone mystery. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The photograph, the sepia-toned photograph, sat on Dr. Margaret Chen's desk like an accusation. Dated August 15, 1910. It showed two young people standing beside Old Faithful, their faces bright with the enthusiasm of youth. The handwritten note on the back read, Eleanor and Edmund Blackwood, age 19, Yellowstone. Margaret adjusted their reading glasses and studied the image more carefully. The twins were nearly identical in height and build, their dark hair catching the afternoon light. Eleanor wore a practical traveling dress, while Edmund sported a wool vest and knickers typical of the era. Both smiled at the camera, with the easy confidence of the privileged class. What made the photograph extraordinary wasn't its age or historical significance. It was the woman who had delivered it to Margaret's office that morning, a woman who looked exactly like Eleanor Blackwood, down to the distinctive cleft in her chin and the unusual amber color of her eyes. Dr. Chen, her assistant, James, knocked on the door frame. The woman who brought the photograph is here for her appointment. Margaret glanced at her watch. 3 o'clock, exactly as scheduled. She took a deep breath and straightened her blazer. As Yellowstone's chief historian and archivist, she'd encountered plenty of unusual requests over her 20-year career, but nothing quite like this. Send her in. The woman who entered moved with a grace that seemed to belong to another era. She wore modern clothes, dark jeans, and a cream-colored sweater, but carried herself with the posture of someone accustomed to corsets and long skirts. Her hair was styled in a simple bob, and her face was unlined despite what would have to be an impossible age. Chen, thank you for seeing me. The woman's voice carried a slight accent that Margaret couldn't quite place. I'm Eleanor Blackwood. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk. Please, sit. I have to admit, Miss Blackwood, your request was intriguing. You claim to be the woman in this 1910 photograph. Eleanor settled into the chair with fluid movements. I don't claim to be her, Dr. Chen. I am her. That would make you... Margaret did quick mental math. 132 years old. 131. My birthday isn't till October. Eleanor's smile was patient, as if she'd had this conversation many times before. I know how it sounds. I know what you're thinking. But I need your help to find my brother. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying Eleanor's face. The resemblance to the woman in the photograph was uncanny, not just similar, but identical. Even accounting for excellent genetics and modern cosmetics, it was impossible. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are who you claim to be. Margaret said carefully. What happened to your brother Edmund? Eleanor's expression grew troubled. That's what I'm hoping you can help me discover. We were separated in 1910, shortly after this photograph was taken. I've been searching for him ever since. For over a century, yes. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a leather portfolio. I have documentation, if you'd like to see it. Birth certificates, travel records, newspaper clippings, all authentic, I assure you. Margaret accepted the portfolio with skeptical hands. The documents inside were yellowed with age, their edges brittle. A birth certificate from Boston, dated 1900, a newspaper clipping from the Boston Herald, announcing the engagement of Miss Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of industrialist Cornelius Blackwood, to Mr. Reginald Ashworth, of New York. The engagement announcement was dated September 1910, just 1 month after the Yellowstone photograph. You were engaged? Margaret asked. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Briefly, my father arranged it. Of course, Reginald was from a good family, had excellent prospects. I was expected to be grateful for the match. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. But then something happened in Yellowstone, something that changed everything. What kind of something? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes distant. Have you ever heard of the Fountain of Youth, Dr. Chen? Margaret raised an eyebrow. The mythical spring that supposedly grants eternal youth. Of course. What if it wasn't mythical? What if it was real, hidden in one of the most geologically active places on Earth? Eleanor leaned forward. What if my brother and I found? The office fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of tourists outside. Margaret set down the portfolio and studied Eleanor's face, looking for any sign of deception or mental instability. She found neither. Blackwood. Margaret said slowly, I think you should start from the beginning. August it. The train whizzed to a stop at the Gardiner station, releasing a cloud of steam that mingled with the crisp mountain air. Eleanor Blackwood stepped onto the platform, her traveling dress dusty from the long journey from Boston. Beside her, her twin brother Edmund stretched his arms above his head and grinned. Finally, I thought we'd never escape that stuffy car. Edmund's eyes sparkled with excitement as he surveyed the rugged landscape. Look at those mountains, Ellie. Have you ever seen anything so magnificent? Eleanor had to admit the view was breathtaking. The peaks of the Absaroka Range rose like ancient sentinels against the azure sky, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the afternoon sun. After the smoky confines of Boston, the clean air felt like a blessing. It's beautiful, she agreed, though her mind was elsewhere. In just the same weeks, she would return to Boston to marry Regina Lasworth, a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. This expedition to Yellowstone was her father's wedding gift, and her last taste of freedom. Mr. and Miss Blackwood, a weathered man in his 50s, approached them, his clothes practical and well-worn. I'm Thomas Garrett, your guide. Welcome to Yellowstone. Edmund shook the man's hand enthusiastically. Mr. Garrett, we've read about your expeditions in the National Geographic. It's an honor to meet you. Garrett's lined face creased into a smile. The honor's mine, young man. Your father spoke highly of you both. In his letters, said you were keen naturalists. Edmund, more than I, Eleanor said. I'm along for the adventure. Nothing wrong with that, miss. Yellowstone has plenty of adventure to offer. Garrett gestured toward a waiting wagon, loaded with supplies. We'll spend tonight in Mammoth Hot Springs, then head into the backcountry tomorrow. I've planned a route that will show you some of the park's hidden wonders. As they rode through the park's northern entrance, Garrett regaled them with stories of geysers and hot springs, of bears and wolves, of geological mysteries that scientists were only beginning to understand. Eleanor found herself drawn into his tales, despite her melancholy mood. The Shoshone people have stories about this place, Garrett said as they passed a steaming hillside. They speak of sacred waters that can heal any ailment, springs that hold the power of the earth itself. Surely you don't believe in such superstitions, Edmund said, though his tone was curious rather than dismissive. Garrett shrugged. I've seen things in 30 years of guiding that would challenge any man's notion of what's possible. The earth here is alive in ways that defy explanation. Best to keep an open mind. They spent the evening at the Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel, dining on elk steaks and listening to other guests share their Yellowstone experiences. Eleanor noticed how Edmund hung on everywhere, his notebook filling with observations and sketches. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in weeks she felt her spirits lifting. The next morning, they set out into the wilderness with pack horses and camping gear. Garrett led them south through the Hayden Valley, where vast herds of bison grazed in the distance like remnants of a primordial world. They camped beside the Yellowstone River, falling asleep to the sound of rushing water and the haunting calls of wolves. On their third day, Garrett took them off the established trails, following what appeared to be an ancient game path through dense forest. There's something I want to show you, he said mysteriously, something most visitors never see. They climbed steadily through, stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the air growing thinner and cooler. Eleanor's legs itched from the unaccustomed exercise, but she refused to complain. Edmund bounded ahead like a mountain goat, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. Near midday, they emerged into a hidden valley that took Eleanor's breath away. It was like stepping into a fairy tale, a perfect bowl of green meadow surrounded by towering peaks, with a crystal-clear stream meandering through its center. But what made the valley truly extraordinary were the springs. Dozens of them dotted the landscape, ranging from small seeps to pools large enough to bathe in. Steam rose from their surfaces in ghostly spirals, and the water gleamed with an opalescent quality that seemed almost supernatural. The air itself felt different here, charged with energy, alive with possibility. "My God," Edmund whispered. "It's like the Garden of Eden." Garrett nodded solemnly. "The Sosone call it the Valley of Eternal Waters. They say it's where the Great Spirit first breathed life into the world." Eleanor walked to the edge of the nearest spring, mesmerized by the play of light on its surface. The water was perfectly clear, revealing a bottom of smooth stones that seemed to glow with inner fire. Without thinking, she knelt and dipped her fingers into the pool. The water was warm, not hot like the other thermal features they'd encountered, but pleasantly warm, like a perfect bath. More than that, it seemed to tingle against her skin, sending waves of energy up her arm. She felt suddenly more alive, more aware, as if every cell in her body had awakened. "Ellie, look at this," Edmund called from across the meadow. He was kneeling beside a larger spring, his face flushed with excitement. "The mineral content here must be extraordinary. I've never seen water with this kind of luminescence." Eleanor reluctantly withdrew her hand from the pool and joined her brother. This spring was different from the others. Larger, deeper, with water that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As she watched, colors swirled beneath the surface, like liquid aurora. "We should take samples," Edmund said, reaching for his collection kit. "No," Garrett's voice was sharp, urgent. "Some things are meant to be left undisturbed." But Edmund was already filling a glass vial with the glowing water. As soon as the liquid touched the container, it seemed to lose its luminescence, becoming ordinary spring water. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something was wrong. The valley, which had seemed so magical moments before, now felt ominous, watching. "We should go," she said quietly. Garrett nodded, his weathered face grave. "Aye, miss. We should indeed." But as they prepared to leave the valley, Eleanor couldn't resist one last look at the spring. In that moment, she could have sworn she saw something moving in the depths of the largest pool. A shadow that might have been a reflection, or might have been something else entirely, something that was watching them leave. Presente, Margaret Chen poured herself a second cup of coffee and settled back in her chair. Eleanor's story was impossible, yet the woman told it with such quiet conviction that Margaret found herself believing despite her better judgment. "You drank from the spring," Margaret said. "It wasn't a question." Eleanor nodded. "Not intentionally. After we left the valley, I became ill. Fever, chills, terrible headaches. Edmund was fine. He hadn't touched the water directly, only collected samples. But I had put my hands in that first spring, and somehow the water got into your system." Thomas Garrett knew what was happening. He'd seen it before, he said, though rarely. The Sosone had warned him about the sacred waters, told him they could change a person in ways that weren't always welcome. Eleanor's voice grew distant. "They tried to help me, but there was nothing to be done, except wait and see if I would survive the transformation." Margaret leaned forward. "What kind of transformation?" "For 3 days, I burned with fever. Edmund never left my side, cooling my forehead with wet cloths, forcing water between my lips. I was delirious most of the time, seeing visions of the Earth's creation, feeling the pulse of the planet itself running through my veins." Eleanor paused, her amber eyes reflecting memories of pain and wonder. On the fourth morning, I woke feeling better than I had in my entire life. Stronger, more alert, more alive. But it wasn't until weeks later that we realized what had really happened. You stopped aging. Gradually, yes. At first, it was subtle. My skin seemed clearer. My hair shinier. Edmund joked that the mountain air was good for me. But as months passed, while he continued to mature and change, I remained exactly as I had been in that valley. Margaret studied Eleanor's face, looking for signs of cosmetic surgery or other artificial enhancements. She found none. The woman's skin had the smooth perfection of youth, but her eyes held the depth and wisdom of someone who had lived far longer than any human should. What about your brother? Did he try to find the valley again? Eleanor's expression darkened. Edmund became obsessed with the springs. He analyzed the water samples he'd collected, but they showed nothing unusual, just ordinary mineral water. He was convinced that the secret lay in the location itself, in some unique combination of geological factors that couldn't be replicated. Did you tell anyone else about what happened? How could we? Who would have believed us? Even our father dismissed Edmund's theories as the fantasies of an overexcited young man. Eleanor's voice carried the weight of old pain, but Edmund wouldn't let it go. He spent every penny of his inheritance funding expeditions back to Yellowstone, searching for the valley. And did you go with him? At first, yes. But each trip ended in failure. The valley seemed to have vanished, as if it had never existed. Edmund grew desperate, then obsessed, then Eleanor trailed off, her hands clenching in her lap. What happened to him? In 1915, he disappeared during one of his expeditions. The search parties found his camp, his equipment, even his journal. But Edmund himself was never seen again. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. You think he found the valley? I think the valley found him. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. And I think he's still there, somewhere, waiting for me to find him. The office fell silent. Outside, Margaret could hear the sounds of tourists enjoying their Yellowstone vacation, children laughing, cameras clicking, the distant rumble of Old Faithful erupting. Normal sounds from a normal world that suddenly seemed very far away. Blackwood, Margaret said, carefully, why are you telling me this? Why now, after all these years? Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope, because 3 weeks ago, a park ranger found this. She slid a photograph across the desk. It was modern, digital, taken with a high-resolution camera. It showed a section of wilderness that Margaret recognized as the remote backcountry near the Thoroughfare region. In the center of the image, barely visible among the trees, was a figure, a man in early 20th century clothing, standing perfectly still, watching the camera. Margaret's breath caught. Even at a distance, the resemblance to the young Edmund in the 1920s. The ranger who took this photo said he felt compelled to hike into that area, as if something was calling him there. Eleanor continued. When he developed the image, he was shocked to see the figure. He reported it to his supervisors, thinking it might be someone in period costume who had gotten lost. But when they sent a search team, they found nothing. No trace of anyone having been in that area for years. Eleanor's eyes met Margaret, except for one thing. She reached into the envelope again and produced a small glass vial filled with water that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. They found this, Eleanor said softly, sitting on a rock in a small clearing, as if someone had left it there deliberately. Margaret stared at the vial, her scientific mind warring with the evidence before her eyes. The water inside moved with a liquid grace that defied physics, swirling in patterns that seemed almost alive. You think Edmund left this for you to find? I think he's been trying to contact me for decades, and finally found a way. Eleanor carefully returned the vial to the envelope. Dr. Chen, I need your help to organize an expedition to that area. I need to find my brother and bring him home. Margaret looked from the photograph to Eleanor's ageless face, then back to the impossible vial of glowing water. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was elaborate fraud, an elaborate hoax designed to perpetrate what? What could anyone possibly gain from such an outlandish story? But the evidence was compelling, and Eleanor's sincerity was undeniable. And so more than that, Margaret felt the same pull that the ranger had described, a sense that something in the wilderness was calling, waiting to be discovered. What exactly are you proposing? Margaret asked. Eleanor smiled for the first time since entering the office, and in that smile Margaret caught a glimpse of the adventurous young woman from the 1990s, the entire photograph. I'm proposing we go find the impossible, Dr. Chen, and bring my brother home. I want to know how far this message is reaching. Comment below and tell me which city or country you're watching from. 3 days later, Margaret found herself questioning her sanity as she loaded camping gear into a Park Service vehicle. She had taken a leave of absence from her regular duties, citing special research as her reason, which was technically true, even if her supervisor would never believe the whole truth. Eleanor had insisted on funding the expedition herself, and her resources seemed considerable. She had arranged for permits, equipment, and even a small team of carefully selected researchers who specialized in geological anomalies. Margaret suspected that Eleanor had been planning this expedition for far longer than 3 weeks. Dr. Chen, a young man with sandy hair and earnest blue eyes, approached her. I'm David Morrison, geologist East. Miss Blackwood asked me to join your team. Margaret shook his hand, noting the callouses that spoke of extensive fieldwork. What did she tell you about this expedition? David glanced around nervously. Honestly, not much, she said. You were investigating unusual thermal features in the backcountry, possibly related to undocumented geothermal activity. The pay was too good to refuse, and I have to admit, I'm curious about what could be so secretive. And you're comfortable with that level of uncertainty? Dr. Chen, I've spent the last 5 years studying Yellowstone's thermal features. I know every documented hot spring, geyser, and fumarole in the park. If there's something out there that's been missed, I want to be the one to find it. Margaret nodded approvingly. Eleanor had chosen her team well. People driven by curiosity rather than skepticism. Researchers hungry enough for discovery to suspend disbelief. The rest of the team assembled over the next hour. Dr. Sarah Kim, a botanist specializing in extremophile plant life. Marcus Webb, a photographer and documentarian whose work had appeared in National Geographic. And finally, Jake Thunder, a Shoshone guide whose grandfather had worked in the park during its early days. Eleanor arrived as dressed in practical hiking gear that somehow managed to look elegant. She moved among the team members with easy confidence, asking about their specialties and making them feel valued. Margaret noticed that she revealed nothing about her true age or the real purpose of their expedition. Before we head out, Eleanor said once everyone was assembled, I want to be clear about what we're doing. We're searching for geological features that may not appear on any official map. The terrain will be challenging, and we may encounter phenomena that don't fit conventional scientific models. I need everyone to keep an open mind and follow safety protocols at all times. Jake Thunder stepped forward, his weathered face serious. Blackwood, my grandfather told stories about places in the park that were different, sacred places that could change a person. Are we looking for one of those places? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. We might be, Jake. Would that concern you? The guide was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. My people have always known that this land holds mysteries. If you're seeking them with respect, rather than exploitation, then I'll help you find what you're looking for. They set out from the Torofare trailhead. In the early morning, their packs heavy with equipment and supplies for a week-long expedition. The plan was to hike to the area where the ranger had taken the mysterious photograph. then expand their search from there using Jake's knowledge of traditional Shoshone trails. The first day's hike took them through familiar territory, well-marked trails that thousands of visitors traveled each year. But as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller and more ancient, their trunks scarred by centuries of fire and storm. The air itself seemed different, charged with an energy that made Margaret's skin tingle. The thermal activity is definitely increasing, David reported as they stopped for lunch beside a small creek. His instruments showed elevated ground temperatures and unusual mineral content in the water. There's definitely something significant in this area. Sarah was examining the plant life with equal fascination. I'm seeing species variations I've never encountered before. These ferns, for instance, they're clearly related to common Yellowstone varieties, but the cellular structure is different, more complex. Eleanor listened to their reports with growing excitement, though she tried to hide it. Margaret could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, as if searching for familiar landmarks. That evening, as they set up camp in a meadow surrounded by towering pines, Jake approached Eleanor with a troubled expression. Blackwood, I need to ask you something directly. Are you looking for the Valley of Eternal Waters? Eleanor froze, her hands stealing on the tent stakes she was driving into the ground. You know about the valley? My grandfather was Thomas Garrett's friend. He told me about the expedition in Minnorsin. The thing is dead, about the young woman who was changed by the sacred waters. Jake's dark eyes studied Eleanor's face. He also told me that she would return someday when the time was right. Margaret felt her breath catch. Around the campfire, the other team members had gone quiet, sensing the weight of the conversation. Your grandfather knew what happened to me? Eleanor asked softly. Jake nodded. He said the spirits of the valley chose you for a purpose, that someday you would need to return to fulfill that purpose. He paused, then added, he also said you wouldn't be alone when you did. Eleanor's gaze moved to Margaret, then to the rest of the team. He knew about Edmund. He knew that the valley takes what it needs and gives what it chooses. Your brother wasn't lost, Miss Blackwood. He was claimed. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. Margaret felt as if she stood at the edge of a precipice, about to step into a world where the impossible was not only possible but inevitable. Can you find it? Eleanor asked. The valley? Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. I can try, but I should warn you, my grandfather said that the valley only reveals itself to those who are ready for what they'll find there. And sometimes what we find isn't what we expected. Eleanor stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, her silhouette outlined against the darkness of the forest. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of more than a century of searching. I've been ready for over 100 years, Jake. It's time to bring my brother home. On the fourth day of their expedition, Jake led them off any recognizable trail, onto paths that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. The landscape grew increasingly surreal as they climbed trees twisted into impossible shapes, rocks balanced in defiance of gravity, and the very air shimmered with heat that had no visible source. The GPS is going crazy, David reported, tapping his device with frustration. According to this, we're walking in circles, but I know we're moving in a straight line. Sarah was documenting plant specimens that seemed to change even as she watched them. The cellular activity here is off the charts. It's as if the entire ecosystem is in a state of constant flux. Margaret felt it too, a sense of displacement, as if they were walking between worlds. The rational part of her mind insisted that they were simply experiencing the effects of altitude and unusual mineral deposits, but her instincts told a different story. Eleanor had grown increasingly agitated as the day progressed. She moved with the restless energy of someone approaching a long-sought destination, her amber eyes scanning every ridge and valley with desperate intensity. "It's close," she murmured, as they paused for water. "I can feel it," Jake nodded grimly. "The spirits are stirring. They know we're here." Marcus, who had been quietly documenting their journey, lowered his camera with a puzzled expression. "This is going to sound crazy, but my equipment is picking up images that aren't there." He showed them the camera's display screen. In the background of what should have been a simple landscape shot, ghostly figures moved among the trees, translucent forms that seemed to be from another time period. "Temporal echoes," Eleanor whispered. "The valley exists in multiple time streams simultaneously. We're seeing glimpses of the past." "That's impossible," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "So is a woman who hasn't aged in over a century," Margaret pointed out. "I think we need to expand our definition of possible." They crested a ridge just as the sun reached its zenith, and suddenly the world opened before them, like a flower blooming in fast motion. The valley of eternal waters lay spread below them in all its impossible glory, exactly as Eleanor had described it from her memories of. But it was also different. The springs still dotted the landscape like jewels, their waters gleaming with opalescent light. But now there were structures among them, buildings that seemed to grow from the earth itself, their architecture flowing and organic. And moving among these structures were figures in clothing from various time periods, as if the valley had collected visitors from across the decades. "My God," Sarah breathed. "It's like a temporal crossroads." Eleanor was already moving down the slope, her careful composure finally cracking. "Edmund," she called. "Edmund, I'm here." The figures in the valley turned toward her voice, and Margaret saw faces from different eras, a Victorian woman in bustled skirts, a man in 90s Bentley's attire, a family that looked like they belonged in the. All of them appeared to be in their prime, untouched by age or time. And then, emerging from one of the organic buildings, came a young man in early 20th century hiking clothes. Even at a distance, Margaret could see the family resemblance, the same dark hair, the same amber eyes, the same determined set to the jaw. "Ellie," his voice carried across the valley with impossible clarity. "Ellie, is that really you?" Eleanor ran toward her brother, tears streaming down her face. They met in the center of the valley, embracing with the desperate intensity of siblings, separated by more than a century of searching. Margaret and the rest of the team descended more cautiously, their scientific minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. The valley defied every law of physics and biology they knew, yet it existed with undeniable reality. "Welcome," said a woman, in Victorian dress as they reached the valley floor. "I am Constance Whitmore. I arrived here in 1887 and have been waiting ever since." "Waiting for what?" Margaret asked. "For the time to be right," Constance replied with a serene smile. "The valley exists outside normal time. You see, we are all here for a purpose, though that purpose isn't always immediately clear." Jake approached one of the springs with reverent caution. "The sacred waters," he murmured. "My grandfather said they were a gift from the Great Spirit, but also a test." "A test of what?" David asked. "His geological instruments registering readings that should have been impossible, of whether humanity is ready for the responsibility that comes with such power," said Edmund, approaching with Eleanor still clinging to his arm. "I've had over a century to think about it, and I'm still not sure we are." Eleanor looked up at her brother with wonder and confusion. "You haven't aged either. How is that possible?" Edmund's expression grew troubled. "The valley claimed me, Ellie. When I finally found it again, in 1915, I was so desperate to understand its secrets that I ignored the warnings." He drank deeply from the central spring, thinking it would give me the same gift you'd received. And it did. Yes and no. I stopped aging, but I also became bound to this place. I can't leave the valley, Ellie. I've become part of it, just like all the others. Margaret felt a chill of understanding. The valley collects people. That's why it reveals itself, to gather those who might be able to protect its secrets, or those who might be able to help it fulfill its purpose, added Constance. We are guardians in a sense, but we're also prisoners. Eleanor stepped back from her brother, her face pale with the realization. You can't come home with me. No, Edmund said gently, but you can stay here with me. The valley has been calling you back, Ellie. You've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the sense that you belong here. Margaret saw the conflict in Eleanor's eyes, the joy of finding her brother warring with the horror of understanding what a reunion would cost. Around them, the other inhabitants of the valley watched, with expressions of sympathy and understanding. There has to be another way, Eleanor whispered. Perhaps there is, said Jake quietly. My grandfather's story spoke of a choice that would one day be offered, a way to break the cycle, but only at great cost. All eyes turned to him, and Margaret felt the weight of destiny settling over the valley like a shroud. Whatever choice lay ahead, she sensed that it would change not just Eleanor's fate, but the fate of everyone present. The springs pulsed with brighter light, as if responding to the tension in the air, and Margaret realized that their expedition had become something far more significant than a simple search and rescue mission. They had stumbled into the heart of a mystery that had been waiting over a century to be resolved. As evening approached, the valley transformed into something even more magical. The springs began to glow with increased intensity, their light painting the surrounding landscape in shifting patterns of blue, green, and gold. The temporal echoes became more pronounced, with ghostly figures from different eras moving through the valley like actors on a vast stage. Eleanor sat beside the central spring with Edmund, their hands clasped as they tried to bridge the gap of more than a century of separation. Margaret and the rest of the team had been given quarters in one of the organic buildings, which seemed to reshape itself to accommodate their needs. The architecture is alive, Sarah marveled, running her hands along walls that pulsed with a gentle warmth. It's not built, it's grown. David was taking readings that defied explanation. The energy output from the springs is enormous, but it's not thermal. It's something else entirely, something that doesn't fit any known classification. Marcus had given up trying to photograph the valley's inhabitants, as they appeared differently in each image, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, sometimes not at all. It's as if the camera can't decide which timeline to capture, he muttered. Jake sat in meditation beside one of the smaller springs, his grandfather's stories guiding him toward understanding. The water isn't just changing people, he said eventually. It's connecting them to the Earth's life force itself. That's why they can't age. They've become part of the planet's eternal cycle. Margaret found herself drawn to Constance Whitmore, the Victorian woman who seemed to serve as an unofficial leader among the valley's inhabitants. How many of you are there? Margaret asked, as they walked among the glowing pools. 47, at last count, Constance replied. We come from different times, different places, but we all share one thing in common. We were all searching for something when we found this place. And what were you searching for? Constance smiled sadly. My husband. He was a geologist who disappeared during an expedition to Yellowstone, and Horia came looking for him and found this. She gestured to the impossible valley around them. He learned that some searches lead us not to what we've lost, but to what we're meant to become. Did you ever find your husband? In a way, he's here, but not as I expected. The valley showed me that love transcends the boundaries we think are absolute. Time, space, even death itself. Constance paused beside a spring that reflected the stars, despite the lingering daylight. But it also showed me that some sacrifices are too great to ask of another. Margaret felt a chill of premonition. What do you mean? Before Constance could answer, a commotion arose from the central spring. Eleanor was standing in the water up to her waist, her face illuminated by the pool's ethereal glow. Edmund stood on the shore, his expression anguished. Ellie, no, you don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying a new authority. I've spent over a century running from what I became, trying to live a normal life in an abnormal situation, but I was never meant to be normal, was I? The valley chose me for a reason. Margaret raced to the spring's edge along with the others. Eleanor, get out of there. We don't know what prolonged exposure might do. I know exactly what it will do, Eleanor said calmly. It will complete the transformation that began. It will become a true guardian of this place, able to protect its secrets and guide others who find their way here. But you'll be trapped here forever, Margaret protested. Eleanor's smile was serene. Will I? Or will I finally be free? The water around her began to swirl faster, and Margaret could see changes beginning in Eleanor's appearance. Her skin took on a luminescent quality, and her eyes began to glow with the same opalescent light as the springs. There is another way, Jake said suddenly, stepping forward. My grandfather's stories spoke of a choice that could break the cycle, but only if someone was willing to serve as a bridge between worlds. What kind of bridge? Edmund. Jake looked around at the assembled group, the valley's inhabitants, the mother and expedition team, and the siblings who had been separated by time itself. Someone who could carry the valley's gift back to the outside world, but without being bound to this place. Someone who could ensure that the knowledge and power here is used wisely. That's impossible, Constance said. The valley doesn't release its guardians, unless, Jake continued, someone willingly takes on the burden of connection without claiming the gift of immortality. Someone who accepts the responsibility of protecting the valley's secrets while remaining mortal. Margaret felt the weight of understanding settle over her. You're talking about a sacrifice. Someone would have to give up the chance for eternal life in order to free the others. Not all the others, Jake clarified. The valley needs some guardians to remain. But it could release those who have been here longest, allow them to return to the world with their memories intact, but their immortality ended. Eleanor paused in her transformation, the water around her stilling. And who would make such a sacrifice? Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding the spring. Her team members, the valley's inhabitants, Eleanor and Edmund. She thought about her life as a historian, dedicated to preserving knowledge and protecting the past for future generations. She thought about the impossible responsibility of keeping the valley's secrets safe while ensuring they could benefit humanity. I will, she said quietly. The valley fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of the springs. Even the temporal echoes seemed to pause, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Margaret, no, Eleanor said, stepping toward the shore. You don't understand what you're offering. I understand perfectly, Margaret replied, echoing Eleanor's earlier words. I'm a historian. My job is to preserve our knowledge and protect it from those who would misuse it. This is just a larger scale than I'm used to. She stepped into the central spring, feeling the warm water embrace her like a living thing. Immediately, she could sense the vast network of energy that connected the valley to the earth itself. A web of life force that pulsed with the planet's heartbeat. The choice is made, said a voice that seemed to come from the springs themselves. The bridge will be built. Margaret felt their transformation begin, but it was different from what she had witnessed with Eleanor. Instead of gaining immortality, she felt herself becoming a conduit, a living connection between the valley and the outside world. She would age and die as nature intended, but she would carry the valley's wisdom with her, serving as its guardian and protector until her natural end. Around the spring, she saw the oldest inhabitants beginning to shimmer and fade, not disappearing, but returning to their own times with their memories intact. But their immortality lifted. They would live out their natural lives, but they would remember and they would help protect the valley's secrets. Eleanor and Edmund remained, but Margaret could see that they now had a choice. They could stay as guardians, or they could leave and live normal lives, aging naturally from this point forward. "The cycle is broken," Margaret whispered as the transformation completed. "The choice is yours." The valley pulsed with light one final time, and Margaret knew that everything had changed. The impossible had become possible, and the burden of protecting one of the world's greatest mysteries now rested on her shoulder. But as she looked at the faces around her, some departing, some staying, all touched by wonder, she knew she had made the right choice. The Valley of Eternal Waters would endure, and its secrets would be safe. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in her office at Yellowstone, staring at a report that would never be filed. The official expedition records showed a routine geological survey that had discovered several new thermal features of moderate scientific interest. Nothing more. The truth was far more complex. Eleanor and Edmund had chosen to leave the valley together, accepting the return of mortality in exchange for the chance to live as siblings in the modern world. They had aged slightly during the transition, enough to appear as people in their 30s rather than teenagers, but they retained their memories of the century they had experienced. Most of the valley's long-term inhabitants had also chosen to return to the world, though a few elected to remain as guardians. Constance Whitmore had been among those who left, finally ready to let go of her search for her lost husband and embrace whatever time remained to her. The valley itself had not disappeared, but it had become even more selective about revealing itself. Margaret could feel its presence in her mind, a constant, gentle awareness that connected her to the Earth's deepest mysteries. She knew that if she needed to find it again, she could, but she also knew that such visits would be rare and purposeful. "Dr. Chen?" Eames knocked on her door frame. "There's someone here to see you." Margaret looked up to see David Morrison standing in her doorway, his expression troubled. "David? He thought you'd returned to your university position." He entered and closed the door behind him. "I did, but I can't stop thinking about what we experienced out there. The readings I took, the things I saw." "Margaret, we discovered something that could change everything we know about geology, about energy, about life itself." Margaret studied his face carefully. David had been one of the few expedition members who had not entered the valley itself. He had remained on the ridge, taking measurements and observations from a distance. As a result, he retained his scientific skepticism along with his memories. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting we mount a proper expedition, get funding from the National Science Foundation, bring in a full team of researchers. We could..." "No." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "We couldn't." David stared at her in confusion. "Why not? This could be the discovery of the century." "David, some discoveries are too dangerous to share. Some knowledge comes with responsibilities that most people aren't ready to handle." Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of her new role as guardian. "The valley revealed itself to us for a specific purpose. That purpose has been fulfilled. But the scientific implications would lead to exploitation, commercialization, and ultimately destruction." Margaret interrupted. "How long do you think it would take before someone tried to bottle and sell the water? Before governments tried to weaponize it? Before the valley became just another tourist attraction?" David was quiet for a long moment, his scientific ambition warring with his growing understanding of what she was saying. "So we just forget about it?" he asked, finally. "We remembered it," Margaret corrected. "We protect it, and we trust that if the world is ever ready for such knowledge, the valley will reveal itself again." After David left, looking frustrated but thoughtful, Margaret turned to her computer and began typing. Not an official report, but a personal account. A record of what had really happened, to be sealed and stored for future generations who might be better equipped to handle such revelations. As she wrote, she felt a familiar presence and looked up to see Eleanor standing in her doorway. The woman looked remarkably normal now, still beautiful, but with the subtle signs of someone in her 30s, rather than the ageless perfection she had possessed before. "How are you adjusting?" Margaret asked. Eleanor smiled and took a seat. "It's strange, feeling time move forward again. He had forgotten what it was like to wake up and know that I was a day older than when I went to sleep. She paused, then added, "But it's also liberating. For the first time in over a century, I can plan for the future without knowing exactly what it will bring." And Edmund is enrolled in graduate school, if you can believe it. Wants to study geology properly this time, without the obsession that drove him before. Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "We're both learning to be human again." Margaret nodded, understanding the complexity of their situation. "Do you ever regret the choice?" "Never. The valley gave us a gift, but it was a gift that came with a price. Now we have a different gift, the chance to live normal lives with extraordinary memories." Eleanor leaned forward. "What about you? Do you regret becoming the guardian?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Since leaving the valley, she had felt the constant presence of its awareness in her mind. Not intrusive, but comforting, like knowing that she was connected to something vast and eternal. She had also begun to notice changes in herself, a deeper understanding of natural systems, an ability to sense the health of the land around her, a growing wisdom that seemed to come from the earth itself. "No," she said finally, "I think this is what I was meant to do. I've spent my career preserving the past for the future. Now I'm preserving the present for whenever humanity is ready to receive it." Eleanor smiled and stood to leave. The valley chose well. After Eleanor left, Margaret returned to her writing, documenting every detail she could remember. As she worked, she felt the valley's approval, a warm pulse of energy that reminded her she was not alone in her guardianship. Outside her window, Old Faithful erupted on schedule, sending its column of superheated water high into the air. Tourists gathered to watch and photograph the spectacle, marveling at the power of nature while remaining safely ignorant of the far greater mysteries that lay hidden in the wilderness beyond. Margaret smiled and continued writing. Some secrets were worth keeping, and some responsibilities were worth accepting. The valley of eternal waters would endure, protected by those who understood that the greatest discoveries were not always meant to be shared. At least, not yet. 5 years later, Margaret Chen stood at the edge of Yellowstone Lake, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. At 53, she showed more signs of aging than she had in the previous 5 years combined. Silver threads in her dark hair, lines around her eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through experience. The valley's influence had not granted her immortality, but it had given her something perhaps more valuable, a deep understanding of her place in the natural world. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Eleanor. "Edmund's thesis defense is next week. You should come." Margaret smiled, typing back, "Wouldn't miss it." Edmund Blackwood had indeed completed his graduate studies in geology, writing a dissertation on unusual geothermal phenomena that carefully skirted the truth while advancing legitimate scientific understanding. He had become a respected researcher, his work helping to protect sensitive thermal features throughout the park system. Eleanor had found her own path, working as a consultant for historical preservation societies, her unique perspective on the past proving invaluable in protecting cultural heritage sites. Both siblings had married, Eleanor to a kind archaeologist who never questioned her occasionally anachronistic knowledge, Edmund to a fellow geologist who shared his passion for protecting natural wonders. They were building normal lives, aging gracefully, their extraordinary past a secret they carried with quiet dignity. Margaret's role as guardian had evolved over the years. She had become Yellowstone's unofficial protector of mysteries, quietly redirecting research that came too close to dangerous truths, guiding policy decisions that would preserve the park's most sensitive areas, and occasionally counseling visitors who had experienced things they couldn't quite explain. The valley itself had remained hidden, though Margaret felt its presence constantly. Twice in the past 5 years, She had been called to guide lost hikers away from areas where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Once she had helped a young Native American woman who had accidentally stumbled into a temporal echo, experiencing visions of her ancestors that left her shaken but profoundly changed. Dr. Chen? Margaret turned to see Jake Thunder approaching, his weathered face creased with concern. Now in his 70s, Jake had become her closest ally in protecting the park's secrets, his traditional knowledge complementing her scientific understanding. What is it, Jake? There's been another sighting. A park ranger reported seeing figures in period clothing near the thoroughfare region. The description matches the area where we found the valley. Margaret felt a familiar tingle of awareness. The valley was stirring again, perhaps preparing to reveal itself to new seekers. Do we know anything about the ranger who made the report? Sarah Martinez, 28 years old. Been with the Park Service for 3 years. Her supervisor says she's reliable, not given to flights of fancy. Jake paused, then added, "There's something else." She mentioned feeling cold to that area, like something was drawing her there. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. The pattern was familiar. The valley chose its own visitors, calling to those who might serve its purposes or benefit from its gifts. I think we need to have a conversation with Ranger Martinez. They found Sarah Martinez at the ranger station, filing her report with obvious reluctance. She was a compact woman with intelligent dark eyes and the weathered hands of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. When Margaret introduced herself as a park historian, Sarah's expression grew wary. "If you're here to tell me I imagined what I saw, you can save your breath," Sarah said defensively. "I know what I experienced out there. I'm not here to dismiss your experience," Margaret replied gently. "I'm here because I believe you. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Sarah's posture relaxed slightly. She described hiking into the remote backcountry on a routine patrol, feeling an inexplicable urge to explore an area that wasn't on her assigned route. She had discovered a small valley that didn't appear on any maps, filled with thermal features unlike anything she had seen before. "The water in the springs was different," Sarah said, struggling to find words. "It seemed to glow from within, and when I looked into it, I could swear I saw faces looking back at me. People in old-fashioned clothes, like they were from another time." "Did you touch the water?" Margaret asked. "No, but I wanted to. It was like the springs were calling to me, promising something I couldn't quite understand." Sarah shook her head. "I know how crazy this sounds, but I felt like I was meant to be there, like the valley had been waiting for me." Margaret exchanged a glance with Jake. The valley was indeed calling again, but this time it seemed to be seeking someone specific. "Sarah, would you be willing to guide us back to this valley, as part of an official research expedition?" Sarah's eyes lit up with relief and excitement. "You mean you believe me? You think there's really something out there?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that Yellowstone still holds mysteries we're only beginning to understand. And I think you might be the key to unlocking one of them." 3 days later, Margaret found herself hiking into the wilderness once again, this time with a smaller team, just herself, Jake, and Sarah. The valley had been calling more insistently, its presence in Margaret's mind growing stronger with each step toward the backcountry. As they climbed through familiar terrain, Margaret reflected on the changes the past 5 years had brought. The valley's influence had spread subtly through the park, creating a network of protection that extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Rangers reported fewer accidents in sensitive areas. Wildlife seemed more abundant and healthy, and the park's thermal features showed signs of increased stability. But more importantly, a new generation of guardians was emerging, people like Sarah, who were naturally attuned to the land's deeper mysteries, who could serve as bridges between the ancient wisdom of the earth and the modern world's need for protection and understanding. "There," Sarah said suddenly, pointing toward a ridge that shimmered in the afternoon heat. "That's where I saw it." As they crested the ridge, The Valley of Eternal Water revealed itself once more, as beautiful and impossible as ever. But this time, Margaret sensed a different purpose in its appearance. The valley wasn't seeking to claim new guardians, it was preparing to share its gifts more widely, to begin the slow process of preparing humanity for the responsibilities that came with such power. Standing beside the Centrale Spring was a figure Margaret recognized, Constance Whitmore, looking exactly as she had when she chose to leave the valley 5 years earlier. But now she appeared translucent, more spirit than flesh. "Welcome back, Margaret," Constance said, her voice carrying across the valley like wind through leaves. "It's time for the next phase to begin." Margaret stepped forward, feeling the weight of her guardianship and the promise of what was to come. The valley had taught her that some mysteries were meant to be preserved, but it had also shown her that knowledge, carefully shared, could transform the world. As Sarah gasped in wonder at the sight before her, and Jake nodded in recognition of his grandfather's stories made manifest, Margaret realized that her role as guardian was evolving once again. She was no longer just a protector of secrets. She was becoming a teacher, preparing others to carry the valley's wisdom into an uncertain future. "What happens now?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the impossible beauty of the valley. Margaret smiled, feeling the valley's ancient presence flowing through her like a river of starlight. "Now we begin the real work. The valley has been waiting for the right time, the right people to start sharing its gifts with the world. But it must be done carefully, gradually, with wisdom and respect." Constance's spirit form simmered as she approached. "The earth is changing, Margaret. Climate shift, environmental destruction, the loss of connection between humanity and the natural world. The valley's power could help heal these wounds, but only if it's wielded by those who understand the true cost of such responsibility." Jake stepped forward, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he knelt beside one of the smaller springs. "My grandfather always said this day would come, when the earth itself would call for healing and the sacred waters would answer." Seren moved, as if in a trance, toward the central spring, a ranger's instincts warring with something deeper, more primal. "I can feel it," she said softly. "It's like the valley is alive, like it's been waiting for us." "Not waiting," Margaret corrected gently. "Preparing. The valley exists outside normal time, so it's been gathering knowledge, wisdom, and power for centuries, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to receive its gifts without destroying them." As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of amber and gold, Margaret felt a familiar sensation of transformation, beginning not in herself this time, but in the very nature of the valley's purpose. The age of hidden guardians was ending, and the age of careful revelation was about to begin. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with awe and uncertainty. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, Jake with his traditional wisdom, Sarah with her modern scientific training, and Constance's spirit, representing the bridge between past and future. She thought of Eleanor and Edmund, living their normal lives while carrying extraordinary memories. She thought of all the guardians who had chosen to return to the world, taking with them the seeds of understanding that would slowly, carefully begin to change humanity's relationship with the natural world. "We start small," Margaret said finally. "We find others like you, Sarah, people who can sense the deeper mysteries, who can be trusted with knowledge that could reshape the world. We teach them to listen to the earth, to understand that true power comes not from domination, but from harmony." The springs pulsed with brighter light, as if approving of her words. In that light, Margaret saw visions of the future, research stations powered by geothermal energy that worked in harmony with natural systems, healing centers where the valley's waters could cure their diseases without being exploited, educational programs that taught children to see themselves as part of the earth, rather than separate from it. "It will take generations," she continued, "but that's how real change happens, not through dramatic revelations that shock the world, but through patient cultivation of wisdom and understanding." Sarah nodded slowly, her hand hovering over the surface of the nearest spring. And if I choose to accept this responsibility, what happens to me? You become a bridge, Margaret replied. Like I did, like Jake has always been. You'll age normally, live a full life, but you'll carry the valley's wisdom with you. You'll help guide others who are ready to learn, and when your time comes, you'll pass the responsibility to someone else, and the valley will endure, will continue to reveal itself to those who need its gifts. We'll slowly, carefully, help humanity remember what it means to be part of the living earth rather than its master. Sarah took a deep breath and lowered her hand into the spring. The water was warm, welcoming, and Margaret felt the familiar tingle of energy as another guardian was chosen. But this time, the transformation was different, gentler, more collaborative. The valley was learning too, adapting its methods to a world that was finally ready to begin listening. As night fell over the valley of eternal waters, Margaret stood with her new companions and felt the weight of the future settling around them like a comfortable cloak. The age of secrets was ending, and the age of careful wisdom was beginning. The valley pulsated with light, one final time, and Margaret knew that everything was about to change, not with the sudden shock of revelation, but with the patient persistence of water wearing away stone, reshaping the world one drop at a time. In the distance, she could hear the sound of Old Faithful erupting, marking time as it had for countless years. But now she understood that even that familiar landmark was part of something larger, something more wonderful than anyone had ever imagined. The earth was alive, and it was finally ready to share its secrets with those wise enough to listen. As they prepared to leave the valley, carrying its gifts back to a world that desperately needed healing, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. Her story as a guardian was far from over, but the first chapter of a much larger tale was finally beginning. The Valley of Eternal Waters would endure, and its legacy would spread like ripples on a pond, touching lives and changing hearts, until the day when humanity truly understood its place in the great web of existence. That day was still far off, but it was no longer impossible. It was inevitable.